December 16, 1944, the Ardennes Forest, Belgium, 0530 hours. The war was supposed to be over. To the men of the 106th Infantry Division huddled in their foxholes along the German border, the sector was known as the Ghost Front. It was a quiet, frozen place where exhausted units were sent to rest and green units were sent to learn the ropes. The intelligence reports were clear. Germany was beaten. The Nazi war machine was out of fuel, out of men, and out of time. The soldiers were dreaming of Christmas turkey and a warm fire in Berlin by January. They were wrong, dead wrong. At 5:30 a.m., the silence of the forest was shattered not by a sniper's bullet, but by the apocalypse. Suddenly, the eastern horizon erupted in a sheet of artificial lightning. The ground shook with the impact of 1,600 German artillery pieces firing simultaneously. It was a barrage so intense that it turned the night sky into a flickering strobe light of death. For 90 minutes, steel rain hammered the American positions, snapping century-old pine trees like matchsticks and burying men in their foxholes. Private First Class Joseph Schechtman, shivering in his dugout, later recalled the sound as 1,000 freight trains crashing into each other at once. But the artillery was just the overture. As the shelling lifted, a dense, freezing fog, known as Hitler's weather, rolled through the valleys. It was a thick, gray blanket that grounded the mighty Allied Air Force. The P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs, the guardian angels of the U.S. Army, sat useless on runways in England and France. The Americans were blind. And out of that mist came the monsters. The ground began to vibrate with a low mechanical growl. Through the fog, the terrifying shapes of King Tiger and Panther tanks emerged. They were painted white to match the snow, looking like ghosts. Behind them marched 200,000 German soldiers, the desperate, fanatical remnants of the Wehrmacht and the Waffen-SS. This was Operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine. It was Adolf Hitler's last desperate gamble. His plan was insane but terrifyingly possible. Punch a hole through the weak American lines, cross the Meuse River, seize the vital port of Antwerp, and split the British and American armies. If he succeeded, he could force a negotiated peace. The American lines crumbled. The 106th Division, young and inexperienced, was overwhelmed. In some sectors, U.S. troops were outnumbered 10-1. Communications were cut, command posts were overrun, confusion reigned supreme. "They're everywhere," screamed the radio operators. "Tanks, infantry, we can't stop them." The German panzers chewed up the frozen roads, bypassing strong points and encircling entire regiments. They moved with a speed and ferocity that the Allies hadn't seen since the Blitzkrieg of 1940. General Dwight Eisenhower, sitting in his headquarters in Versailles, stared at the map. The bulge in the line was growing deeper by the hour. He realized with a sinking heart that the weather was going to hold. His planes couldn't fly, his tanks were outgunned, his infantry was freezing to death in summer uniforms. The Allies were losing the Battle of the Bulge before it had even fully begun. They needed something to stop the wave of German infantry surging through the snow. They needed an equalizer. They needed a weapon that didn't rely on clear skies. But the only weapon that could save them was locked away in a crate, classified top secret and banned from use on the European continent. As the German tanks rolled west, the decision to unleash it became a matter of life and death for the entire Western Front.
Washington, D.C.,
1943. Inside a nondescript building at the Department of Terrestrial Magnetism, a group of physicists led by Dr. Merle Tuve were working on a problem that was arguably harder than building the atomic bomb. The problem was simple geometry, but it was killing thousands of Allied soldiers. In 1944, artillery was the god of war, but it was a blind god. To kill a German soldier hiding in a foxhole, an American gunner had to fire a 155mm shell and make it explode at the exact split second it was directly over the enemy's head. If the fuse was set too short, the shell exploded harmlessly in the sky, frightening the birds but hurting no one. If the fuse was set too long, even by a fraction of a second, the shell would bury itself deep in the mud before detonating. The earth would absorb the blast. The steel shrapnel, designed to shred infantry, would simply stay in the dirt. It was a math problem with zero margin for error, and in the chaos of battle, with cold fingers and terrifying noise, perfect math was impossible. Enter Project A1. The solution proposed by Dr. Tuve's team was science fiction. They wanted to put a radar set inside the nose of an artillery shell. The concept was terrifyingly complex. They needed to build a radio transmitter and receiver using delicate glass vacuum tubes. Then they had to shove this radio into a steel casing. Finally, they had to shoot it out of a cannon. When a 155mm howitzer fires, the shell experiences 20,000 times the force of gravity, 20,000 Gs. It spins at 500 rotations per second. "It's impossible," the military brass said. "You are trying to shoot a light bulb out of a gun and expect it to still work." But the scientists at the Applied Physics Laboratory, APL, did the impossible. They encased the tiny glass tubes in wax and rubber. They built a battery that only activated when the electrolyte shattered upon firing. They created a miracle, the VT, proximity fuse. It was a smart bullet in a dumb war. The fuse didn't care about time. It sent out a radio signal. When that signal bounced off a solid object, like the ground or a German plane, the fuse detected the reflection. When the reflection reached a certain intensity, meaning the shell was exactly 50 feet from the target, it detonated. It was perfect. It guaranteed an air burst every single time. It turned every foxhole into an open grave. But there was a catch so big it paralyzed the Allied command. The VT fuse was classified top secret, second only to the Manhattan Project. The British and American intelligence agencies were terrified of one specific scenario, the dud. Artillery shells have a failure rate. If the Allies fired thousands of VT fuses against the Germans in France, inevitably one would fail to explode. It would land intact in a German field. The Nazi scientists were brilliant. If they recovered a dud VT fuse, they would open it, see the radar tubes, and understand the technology. Within months, they would figure out the frequency. They could build a jammer to make the shells useless. Or worse, they could reverse engineer it. If the Germans built their own VT fuses and gave them to their anti-aircraft batteries, the air war over Europe would be lost. The 8th Air Force flying steady bomber formations would be swatted out of the sky. The invasion of Europe would fail. So the combined chiefs of staff made a cold, hard calculation. To save the bombers, the infantry had to suffer. They issued a strict ban. The VT fuse was prohibited from being fired over land. It could only be used by the Navy over the open ocean, where duds would sink, or by anti-aircraft guns defending London, where duds would land on British soil. By late 1944, millions of these funny fuses had been manufactured. They were sitting in crates in Antwerp and Paris, stacked in freezing warehouses. Frontline artillery commanders knew they existed. They begged for them. "Give us the funny fuses," they radioed. "The Germans are digging in. We can't touch them." But the answer from Supreme Headquarters was always the same: denied. So, as the Battle of the Bulge began, and the German panzers rolled over the freezing Americans in their foxholes, the ultimate weapon sat gathering dust just a few miles away. The secret was safe, but the soldiers were dying. It would take a catastrophe to break the seal, and that catastrophe had just arrived in the Ardennes. December 21, 1944. Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, Chafe, Versailles, France. The room was filled with cigarette smoke and the smell of stale coffee. General Dwight D. Eisenhower stood before the large situational map, his face gray with exhaustion. The red grease pencil marks on the map told a story of disaster. The Bulge was deep and getting deeper. Bastogne was surrounded. St. Vith was crumbling. The elite panzer divisions of the SS were tearing through the American lines like a chainsaw through rotten wood. Outside, the weather was mocking them. A heavy, impenetrable fog had settled over Europe. The mighty Allied Air Force, the thousands of bombers and fighters that had pulverized Germany for months, was grounded. They were useless. Eisenhower turned to his chief of staff, Bedell Smith. "We need to stop them, now." But the reports from the front were grim. The Germans were attacking in waves through the dense pine forests of the Ardennes. American artillery was firing around the clock, but it wasn't enough. The standard HE shells were hitting the frozen ground and burying themselves in the mud before detonating. The earth was absorbing the blast. The German infantry, veterans of the Russian front, knew exactly what to do. When the shelling started, they dove into their foxholes. The shrapnel flew harmlessly over their heads. The Americans were firing thousands of tons of ammunition to kill a handful of Germans. They were losing the math of war. There was, however, a solution, and it was sitting in a freezing warehouse in Antwerp, just 100 miles away. It was a crate marked POSIT. Inside were the VT proximity fuses. For 2 years, these fuses had been the holy grail of Allied technology. They contained a tiny radio transmitter that used radar to detect the ground. They didn't need to hit the earth to explode. They were designed to detonate exactly 50 feet above the ground. An airburst is the most terrifying thing an infantryman can face. When a shell explodes in the air, there is no cover. The shrapnel rains down vertically, turning foxholes into open graves and shredding anyone hiding behind a tree. But there was a problem, a massive, strategic problem. The VT fuse was classified top secret. The combined chiefs of staff in Washington and London had placed a strict ban on its use over land. The fear was simple. If a shell was fired and failed to explode, a dud, and the Germans recovered it, their scientists would reverse engineer the radar technology. If the Luftwaffe got hold of this tech, they could wipe the Allied bomber fleets out of the sky. The invasion would fail. The war could drag on for years. Eisenhower was caught in a trap. If he released the secret weapon, he risked the future of the air war. If he kept it banned, he risked losing the ground war right now. General Lear, commanding the supply sector, sent a desperate message. "The situation is critical. The enemy is massing for a breakthrough. Request permission to release POSIT immediately." Eisenhower looked at the map again. He thought about the thousands of American boys freezing in the snow around Bastogne, holding off tanks with nothing but rifles and bazookas. He thought about the German columns moving freely under the cover of fog. He lit another cigarette. The gamble was enormous. If a single dud fell into German hands, he would be blamed for prolonging the war. But if he didn't act, there might not be an army left to fight it. "The Germans are gambling everything on this offensive," said Eisenhower quietly. "So will we." He picked up the phone. The order was short and absolute. Release them. Release the VT fuses for unrestricted use in the Ardennes. It was a calculated risk. Eisenhower was betting that the weapon would be so lethal, so devastating, that the Germans wouldn't have time to recover a dud. He was betting on total annihilation. Within hours, the Red Ball Express, the massive truck convoy system, was diverted. Drivers were pulled from their bunks. Trucks skidded on the icy roads, racing east toward the sound of the guns. They were carrying crates that didn't look special on the outside, but inside was the technology that would change warfare forever. As the trucks arrived at the artillery batteries of the 12th Army Group, the gunners were confused. They opened the crates and saw shells with strange green plastic noses instead of the usual metal timers. "What are these?" a sergeant asked. "Just load them, and don't touch the nose." It was December 26th. The fog was still thick. The Germans were preparing for their final push to the Maze River. They were confident. They were winning. They didn't know that the rules of the game had just changed. The ban was lifted, the secret was out, and the sky was about to fall on their heads.
December 26, 1944. The southern flank of the Bulge, near the Saar River. The fog that had smothered the Ardennes for 10 days finally began to lift, revealing a world of gray and white. To Obergriffreiter Karl Müller of the 5th Parachute Division, the clearing sky was a mixed blessing. It meant the American fighter bombers would return, but for now, on the ground, he felt invincible. His unit was dug in deep. They were veterans of the Eastern Front. They knew how to survive artillery. "Dig deep, cover your head," the sergeant had told them. In the frozen earth of the forest, the Germans had constructed excellent foxholes. They had covered them with heavy logs and packed earth. They knew the American artillery doctrine. High explosive shells had to hit the ground to detonate. In this deep snow and soft mud, the American shells were burying themselves before exploding. The earth absorbed the blast. As long as you stayed in your hole, you were safe. The shrapnel flew up and out, missing the men hiding below ground level. Müller lit a cigarette, his breath misting in the freezing air. He watched the tree line, waiting for the order to advance. He felt safe. 5 miles away, across the river, the scene was very different. Captain James Reynolds of the U.S. Field Artillery Battalion stood by his 155mm Long Tom guns. His men were loading a new shipment of ammunition. The crates were marked "Pose It." The gunners were confused. The loads looked normal, but the noses were made of a strange green plastic instead of the usual brass time rings. There were no settings to adjust, no math to calculate for flight time. "Just load and fire," Reynolds ordered. "Target the tree line. Don't worry about the ground." At 900 hours, the order came: fire for effect. The ground shook as the battery opened up. Back in the German lines, Müller heard the familiar distant thump of the guns. Then came the whistling scream of incoming freight. He didn't flinch. He simply stubbed out his cigarette and crouched at the bottom of his foxhole, pulling his knees to his chest. He expected the usual, a series of muffled thuds, the ground shaking, and dirt falling on his helmet. He expected to wait it out, then pop up and shoot. But the thuds never came. Instead, the forest exploded above him. The new VT fuses didn't wait to hit the ground. Their tiny radar sets detected the Earth approaching. At exactly 50 feet in the air, the perfect lethal height, they detonated. It was a massacre. From Mueller's perspective, the world turned into a meat grinder. The air bursts sent jagged chunks of red-hot steel plunging straight down. The logs covering the foxholes were turned into splinters. The earth walls offered no protection against rain that fell vertically. The shrapnel didn't fly outward, it slammed downward with the force of a pile driver. Mueller heard a sound he had never heard in Russia or France. It wasn't the sound of battle, it was the sound of screaming. Thousands of men simultaneously. In the foxhole next to him, his sergeant, a man who had survived Stalingrad, was gone. The shell had burst directly overhead. The shrapnel had acted like a giant shotgun blast from the sky, scouring the hole clean. Panic, absolute primal panic, took hold of the German line. Soldiers who were trained to stay put under fire suddenly broke. They realized their holes were graves. They jumped out, running blindly into the woods, trying to find cover where there was none. But the black rain followed them. The shells burst over the open fields, over the roads, over the gullies. There was nowhere to hide. The American observers looking through their binoculars were stunned. They saw entire German companies vanish in clouds of black smoke and red mist. The attacks that had been hammering the American lines for a week simply evaporated. Within 20 minutes, the barrage lifted. Silence returned to the Ardennes, but it was a heavy, wet silence. The pristine white snow was now churned into black mud and stained a dark, terrible red. Mueller was one of the few survivors in his platoon. He sat in his foxhole, uninjured but shaking uncontrollably. He looked up at the shattered trees, stripped of their branches as if by a giant scythe. He looked at the green plastic shards scattered on the ground, the remnants of the magic weapon. He realized then that the war was lost. The Americans had changed the rules of physics. They had made the very air above his head lethal. When the American infantry finally advanced through the woods an hour later, they didn't even have to raise their rifles. They walked past rows of open foxholes, looking down in horror at what the funny fuses had done. The German army hadn't been defeated, it had been shredded. General Patton would later write that the proximity fuse won the Battle of the Bulge for us, but for the German soldiers on the receiving end that morning, it wasn't a victory. It was the day the sky turned into a weapon and the earth offered no sanctuary.
January 1945. The Road to the Rhine. The Battle of the Bulge was over, but the war was not. The German army, once the most feared fighting force in history, was retreating. They were moving back toward the fatherland, dragging their wounded, their broken tanks, and something else. A new, deep-seated terror. For 5 years, the Wehrmacht had relied on a simple rule of survival. If you hear artillery, get underground. They knew that high-explosive shells had to hit the earth to detonate. If you were in a deep foxhole with a log roof, you were safe. You could wait out the barrage, then pop up and man your machine gun. But in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, that rule had been erased. Oberstleutnant Hans von Luck, a veteran commander who had fought in North Africa and Normandy, watched his men. They were different now. They were jumpy. They spent hours reinforcing the roofs of their dugouts, piling feet of dirt on top, looking nervously at the gray sky. They called it the Butcher. The Americans called it the Funny Fuse. It was a piece of plastic and glass that looked like a toy but killed like a god. As the American Third Army under General George Patton pushed forward, the devastating efficiency of the VT fuse became undeniable. It wasn't just about killing the enemy, it was about breaking their will. In a sector near the Siegfried Line, an American artillery battalion prepared for a fire mission. The target was a German assembly area in a dense pine forest. Usually, hitting troops in a forest was difficult because the trees absorbed the blast of ground impacts. "Load VT," the battery commander ordered. The gunners shoved the 155mm shells into the breaches. There was no fumbling with wrenches to set time fuses. There was no calculation of flight time. The radar in the nose did the thinking. They fired. Downrange, the German troops didn't even hear the whistle. The shells arrived at the speed of sound, but instead of burying themselves in the snow, they detonated exactly 50 feet above the treetops. The result was catastrophic. The blast wave stripped the branches off the trees. The shrapnel, mixed with splintered wood, rained down vertically. It didn't matter how deep the foxholes were. The airburst filled every cubic inch of the forest floor with lethal metal. When the American infantry advanced through the area an hour later, they found no resistance. They found a ghost town. Vehicles were riddled with holes like Swiss cheese. The German soldiers were dead in their holes, without a mark on them from the front, only from above. Those who survived were in a state of shock. Interrogation reports from January 1945 tell a chilling story. German prisoners asked their captors one question, over and over: "What is that new shell? It follows us into the hole." General Patton, a man who loved the offensive, saw the change immediately. He realized that the VT fuse had done what tank armies could not. It had neutralized the German infantry's ability to defend. On January 29, 1945, Patton wrote a letter to Major General Levin Campbell, the chief of ordnance in Washington. His words would become the epitaph of the Wehrmacht's defeat in the West. "The new shell with the funny fuse is devastating. The other day we caught a German battalion in the open. They were waiting to counterattack. We fired a battalion volley. When we got there, we found 700 dead. It won the Battle of the Bulge for us. I think that when all armies get this shell, we'll have to devise some new method of warfare." The tech didn't just break the infantry, it broke the Luftwaffe's last gasp. In March 1945, at the Remagen Bridge, the last bridge standing over the Rhine, the Germans threw everything they had to destroy it. They sent dive bombers, jet fighters, even V-2 rockets. But the Americans had ringed the bridge with anti-aircraft guns loaded with VT fuses. The sky over Remagen became a wall of flak. The fuses didn't need a direct hit on a plane, they just had to get close. The radar sensed the aluminum skin of the German jets and detonated. The Luftwaffe was swatted out of the sky like flies. By May 1945, the war in Europe was over. The atomic bomb would get all the headlines in August, ending the war in the Pacific. But the soldiers who fought in the mud and snow of Europe knew the truth. The weapon that truly broke the back of the German army wasn't the one that destroyed cities, it was the one that destroyed their ability to hide. The funny fuse was the first smart weapon in history. It taught a brutal lesson to the Wehrmacht. Against technology that can see, there is no sanctuary. The era of the foxhole was over. The era of electronic warfare had begun.